Well, hello everyone. I just want to start by saying that there is live transcript, closed captioning available. If you're here joining us live, you can click the CC button on your toolbar. Otherwise, greetings. My name is Siri, and I'm your host for this month's Inquiry Series, a virtual speaker series designed to explore inclusivity. This program features sessions with leaders from the outdoor recreation and education sectors who are paving the way towards a more diverse and inclusive outdoor community. For folks tuning in live, I want to let you know that we are recording this webinar to be shared for further viewing on our website. For tonight, I'm really excited to welcome our guest, James Mills. James is a freelance journalist and an independent media producer in a career that spans more than 20 years. He specializes in sharing stories about outdoor recreation, environmental conservation, acts of charitable giving, and practices of sustainable living. He is the author of The Adventure Gap, Changing the Face of the Outdoors, and the co-writer, co-producer of the documentary film An American Ascent. He's currently a faculty assistant at the University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, where he teaches a summer course for undergraduate students on diversity, equity, and inclusion in outdoor recreation and public land management. So there's so much more to say about James, but I'm going to let him tell you all about himself and his work. So without further ado, please take it away, James.
Great, Siri, thank you so much for having me. And I can't tell you how happy I am to be here in community with the Wilderness Inquiry. I've been familiar with the organization for many years, and so this is actually a great opportunity for me to engage this audience and also to be able to hopefully be part of this really great conversation about the importance of diversity and inclusion in outdoor recreation. And I'm going to I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin what can only be described as a pretty broad conversation about the importance of being able to recognize and identify those people who spend time in nature and those who don't, for a variety of different reasons. And that is the subject and title of my book, The Adventure Gap, Changing the Face of the Outdoors. And as it happens, I just returned recently from a remarkable trip to the Denali National Park in Alaska. And over the last 7 days, this was my office view. And one of the things that I think is really important, I'll get to this in greater detail as we continue this conversation, this park, not unlike many national parks across the country, have relatively low participation and representation among people of color. And much of my work revolves around the ability to hopefully correct that. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge and recognize that I'm zooming into you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm blessed to live in the homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place known for time immemorial as Job. And I want to make sure that wherever you are, especially if you're in North America, to recognize and acknowledge the Native people who once called wherever you now call home. Now, one of the things I want to also express is the importance of being able to take a certain amount of authorship for the stories that we tell. And I'm inspired by a quote by Toni Morrison, who once said, "If there's a book you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." And much of my work as a journalist revolves around filling a need that I personally had for myself when it came to the types of stories that I was most interested and eager to hear. And this story in particular actually starts in another national park in the state of Arizona called the Grand Canyon. And in Grand Canyon National Park, it's perhaps one of the most amazing outdoor recreation adventures that you can possibly take, but it's also one of the most exclusive. And just to give you an idea, this is a trip that spans 227 miles over the course of 2 weeks in a completely unadulterated wilderness area. And at this time, in the year 2016, I quite literally won the lottery. Some friends of mine got the opportunity to do a private trip down the Grand Canyon. And to give you an idea what that means, there are 4.5 million annual visitors to the rim of the Grand Canyon and the surrounding areas. But the people who take the trip down the Grand Canyon from the put-in at Lee's Ferry to the takeout at Diamond Creek, again, a distance of 227 miles over the course of 2 weeks, that number is only 29,000 people. And so that gives you an idea of why there are, well, the fact that there is a disparity between who has a high-level adventurous experience in the Grand Canyon and an experience that might be described as strictly observational. Because one of the things that I realized, especially through the course of my time in the outdoor recreation industry, many of my friends share many of the privileges that I have. And my good friend here, Jim Moss, over the course of 40 years of his career, had guided trips down the Grand Canyon. And through almost 20 of those years, he had included me in a list of people that he wanted to take on a lottery bid adventure through the Grand Canyon. And in 2016, the lottery bid came up. He called me up. I was able to take 2 weeks out of my summer on a moment's notice to put together a trip, to be away from home, away from my family, away from my computer, to take this trip. And over the course of this adventure, he turns to me as we're having our evening meal on one of the nights in camp and says, you know, James, I've been guiding trips in this canyon for over 4 decades, and you're the very first African-American that I've ever guided. And that was actually really telling to me, because on this amazing trip, it was having it already being pretty exclusive in terms of who could take a trip like this. It was further exacerbated by the fact that relatively few African-Americans have probably made this journey. Now, that's not to say that no African-Americans or other people of color have taken this trip, but if you look at the rates of participation, you'll find that they're relatively low. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that we have a very clear disparity between those who have the disposable income, leisure time, and desire to make a trip like this. And I think that it really beautifully illustrates the divide between those who have the ability and inclination to spend time in the outdoors and those who don't. And it is a division that is as clearly defined as the Grand Canyon that I ultimately call the adventure gap. Now, my career in the outdoor industry spans, as Siri said, almost 30 years. But it actually began here in Los Angeles, California. And this is a town that I grew up in, and I'm a 3rd generation Los Angelino. And my family still lives in this community today. In fact, if you take a look at this map, that marks the exact geolocation of my residence. This is a place where I grew up from the time I was 6 years old until the time I graduated from high school and went on to college. And that photograph that I showed you a moment ago was taken from this spot. It's called the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. And if you take a look at this map, that's where it is. So it's literally 3 miles from where I grew up. And if you go there today, it's a remarkable area that has a series of hiking trails. It has a very well tended and cultivated wildflowers and natural areas. There is an interpretive ranger there who tells the story of the flora and fauna of this area. And one of the things that I continue to find most striking about this place is that it very clearly illustrates and represents the broad diversity of the city of Los Angeles. And it's very much like the population that I grew up around and with, and that's who visits this site today. But if you look at this site when I was a kid, it looked a little more like this. It's actually one of the most highly industrialized areas in Southern California. In fact, much of the oil that is in the Los Angeles basin is centered right here in a predominantly Black, African-American, and Hispanic community. And one of the things that was most striking to me is how much this area has changed over the last 40 years since I lived there, because it's I think the end result of a lot of really aggressive and direct action taken to not only preserve the environmental rights and justice of the residents of the community, but also their civil rights. In fact, the story actually begins in the civil rights movement. And if you take a look at this photograph, I think you'll all recognize the guy on the left. The guy on the right is my father. My dad, Billy Gene Mills, was the first African-American to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1952. And at the height of the civil rights movement, as a civil rights attorney and also as a city councilman, he was one of many people in the Los Angeles area that greeted and met with many of the dignitaries at the time. In fact, in this photograph with the cut line that reads, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Discusses with Billy Mills some of the problems in King's campaign to win equal rights in the Southern integration movement now being conducted in Alabama. So at the height of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King came to Los Angeles to ask my dad for advice. And when you think about what that does in terms of my own interest in linking my personal family heritage with my current work in environmental protection, there actually is a very direct relationship, and I'll get to that in a moment. My dad was one of the literal movers and shakers of Los Angeles at the time. Here he is standing next to then Mayor Tom Bradley, after whom the airport there is named, meeting then President John F. Kennedy. Not long after that, here's my dad greeting Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles. Again, one of many visits at the time. Much of my family heritage is very deeply steeped in civil rights memorabilia, and my growing up was a big part of being able to enjoy the rights and privileges of being able to have access to the seats of power at the time. But my dad also was a Boy Scout leader, and it was very important to him that he made possible the access to the outdoors for his children and also many of the kids in our community. In 1971, this is what my family looked like. I'm the youngest of five. My mom has a PhD in education. She was an administrator for the Los Angeles School District. Both my sisters followed my mom into education and were teachers. My brother Bill, the oldest boy, was an attorney. And my middle brother John was and still is, a yoga instructor and a fitness teacher. And me, the youngest, became what I like to describe as the outdoor guy. Now, much of my growing up, we spent a lot of time in wild and scenic places. We had vacations in the mountains, and we went fishing. As Boy Scouts, we went hiking and climbing and backpacking. And it was actually pretty much the starting point that began my interest in ultimately having outdoor recreation be my career, because as a kid growing up, it was something that I can envision myself doing. Shortly after college, in fact, the year my friends and I graduated in 1989, my best friend, John Mayer, and I actually hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon to spend the night in Phantom Ranch and to actually experience what it was like to, dip our toes into the Colorado River. And it was at that time I decided that I really wanted to make the long trip that I described to you earlier. Now, also after college, I went on to teach at the campus outing club called Cal Adventures. I worked in Yosemite Valley teaching rock climbing and backpacking. Shortly after graduation, one of my best friends and I, and her then boyfriend, now husband, and several of their friends made a climbing trip to the summit of Mount Whitney, the highest peak in North America. And then once I started thinking about what I wanted to do for a career, I got a job working for a little company called REI. And believe it or not, back then in 1991, there was only 12 REI stores in the entire country. Now there's, I think, close to 300. But I worked as a retail sales clerk and was really excited about having a career in outdoor recreation. From there, I went on to work for a company called the North Face. And I was their very first African-American independent sales representative. And they basically relocated me to the Midwest, where I ran the Midwest territory in an area that can only be described as the Louisiana Purchase. I managed the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, North and South Dakota, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And for almost 5 years, all by myself, just with my dog Jinga, We traveled around the country, the territory, selling backpacks, tents, sleeping bags, hiking boots, and a wide variety of different recreational equipment products. And through that time, I was actually able to have some really fabulous experiences, both nationally and internationally, including this trip with the owner of then Paragus Northwoods Outfitters and my good friend Carl Jacobs. We did a circumnavigation of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that that was very apparent to me throughout much of my career, and these photographs I think beautifully illustrate that, I was almost always the only person of color. And despite having had plenty of opportunities to experience these things myself, it seemed that there was a very clear disparity between those who were having experiences like mine, who looked like me, and those who didn't. And it was really at that point that I decided that, with the support of my wife, Shemaine, who's in this photograph, who at the time and continues to work as a journalist, I decided that I was going to retrain my career in sales and marketing and shift my focus to what can only be described as a career as a writer, photographer, and storyteller. And in 2009, I created a blog and a podcast series to tell the stories of outdoor recreation at the levels of my personal interest, but also to make sure that we're telling stories that are reflective of the broad preponderance of people who spend time in the outdoors. And I created a program called the Joy Trip Project that's now in its 13th season. And here I use this platform to tell stories about how outdoor recreation and environmental conservation can directly impact the quality of a person's life through travel, adventure, and exploration. Now, much of this really came into focus early in the year 2009, the year I started my podcast. And that was actually the year that the documentary film series, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, became a national phenomenon. And early on, I was actually able to visit with filmmaker Ken Burns, the gentleman on the right, and a man who looks a lot like John Muir on the left, who is actually Lee Stetson, who in period dress and clothing is a John Muir impersonator. And he actually tells the story of the national parks and how they were created in Yosemite Valley. And in this series of conversations and interviews that I was able to do with Ken Burns and Lee Stetson, and also Ken Burns' writer, Dayton Duncan, I got kind of a masterclass on the long history of our national parks in advance of the release of the film. And one of the things that I was really eager to know is how this film was going to reflect the interests of people of color, people who look like me. How are we going to tell these stories? And through the course of our conversations, Ken Burns personally tells me the story of Teddy Roosevelt and his relationship with John Muir and the creation of Yosemite. But he also told me something that I'd never heard before. In 1903, and between 1903 and 1906, over 400 members of the US Cavalry, a unit known as the Buffalo Soldiers, were tasked with protecting and preserving Yosemite as a national park. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'd spent my entire life in California. I had spent many, many, many summers teaching and guiding rock climbing and backpacking in Yosemite. But this is the very first time that I'm hearing the story that African Americans actually had a very prominent role in the creation of our national park system. Now, I had heard the stories of the Buffalo Soldiers since I was very young, but I had no idea that these men of the US Army were actually part of the creation of an institution that I came to love. The Buffalo Soldiers were led by a man by the name of Charles Young. And he was the third African-American to graduate from West Point, but he was also one of the very first superintendents of a national park. He was a superintendent of Sequoia National Park, and much of what he had done to create the institutions of preservation and conservation are still in effect today. At the time, as the city of San Francisco was beginning to build and the state of California was beginning to grow, there's a lot of demand for the old growth redwood trees in the Pacific Northwest, as well as in the state of California, it was because of Charles Young and his decisions to preserve those trees that many of them are still standing to this day. And in fact, the work that the Buffalo Soldiers did in Yosemite at the time helped to frame many of the roles that national park rangers do today. So much so that the parks, the picnic tables, the campgrounds that were built then are still in use right now. In fact, the trail that I used with my friends to get to the summit of Mount Whitney was actually created by the Buffalo Soldiers. And it said that in the 3 summers that they had been stationed in Yosemite, that they had done more to protect and preserve this national park than any of the other regiments of the US Army combined. Now, the ironic thing is that while there was over 400 members of the Buffalo Soldiers protecting Yosemite National Park and Sequoia 100 years ago, today, sadly, there's really only one. My friend Shelton Johnson, who, like Lee Stetson, tells the story of the Buffalo Soldiers in period dress and clothing, and tells the story of the Buffalo Soldiers in such a way that he is keeping the memory of what they were able to contribute alive. And so when Ken Burns introduced the National Parks film to Barack Obama that same year, Shelton was in the audience to share the story of the Buffalo Soldiers with the president. And I honestly believe that, not unlike the meeting that Roosevelt had with Muir in 2003, more than 100 years later, I think that the conversation with Shelton Johnson and Barack Obama helped to set and establish a spirit of conservation that persisted throughout his presidency. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what was accomplished in the Obama administration in a moment. But if you go to Yosemite today, much of the work that the Buffalo Soldiers had done to protect and preserve that national park is still very apparent. But what needs to be done is to tell the story, to have a point of engagement so that when people of color come to visit the park, they actually have the opportunity to be made to feel welcome, to be part of the institution that we've all come to love. And so that ultimately, hopefully, the entire representation of our national parks will one day look a little bit like this photograph, where we have a equal representation of the entire American population, and everyone can be invited to become stewards of the natural land. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is we kind of define our terms, and the adventure gap, as I describe it, is actually an observation of a few quantifiable facts. For starters, the Black American population currently represents 13.1% of the US population, but it only represents between 2 and 7% of national park visitors. And if we take a look at census data from the year 2000 to the year 2014, the nation's Black population grew 35% faster than the population as a whole. And also, the Black population is expected to grow from 4.7 million today to 74.5 million, making up 17.9% of the total US population by the year 2060. So as this population continues to grow, it will actually become a much higher percentage of the population than it is today. And in fact, it's estimated that the US will be minority white by the year 2045, basically meaning that there will be more people of color than the predominant white population. And that's not just true in terms of exponential growth of non-white citizens. When it comes to the Black population, is also going to be true of Hispanics, Asian Americans, and those who identify as multiracial. There will come a day when the white population will no longer be a majority. So then we have to ask ourselves, what happens if we fail to engage this emerging demographic? What happens if we don't create an environment where people of color, who will become the majority of the population, will have an affinity for the natural world? And I think that that is what lies at the crux of the dilemma of the adventure gap. But I think that it's really important that we also understand exactly how it is that we got here. Now, we don't have to go all the way back to the institution of slavery to understand the disparities of people and their relationship with the natural world. In fact, we can just go back to the 1930s and the height of what was described as the Jim Crow era, an era of segregation and racial discrimination under the doctrine of separate but equal. It's this division of where people can go and where they can live that ultimately created a regime commonly known as redlining. And essentially what that is a division of where people can physically live and ultimately work and play. Now, I showed you this photograph earlier of where I grew up in Los Angeles, and this is my home in the exact place where it was today. But in the 1930s, the Housing Authority of the federal government created very codified areas where people could and couldn't live. And it's these areas of segregation and discrimination that ultimately define the neighborhoods that we live in today. Now, many of the areas that were designated as for the best possible investment were primarily in the bucolic wooded areas of places like Beverly Hills, Brentwood, Westwood, and along the Pacific Palisades. And those were the green areas. The red areas were defined as places of minimal economic development. And if you take a look at this map that clearly outlines the green areas for the best economic development and the red areas where there is primarily racial segregation, you'll see that I grew up in a racially segregated neighborhood. And it was really only because of the work of my parents and much of the sacrifices that they made to make my life possible. But frankly, my experience was quite the exception. And if you go into these areas today, much of the inferior housing, lower quality schools, and also environmental pollution is concentrated in these primarily geographically designated areas for Black and Hispanic people. And those areas, in many cases, are still in decline to this day. It's important to understand that our natural resources, including the natural environment, was segregated. In fact, if you take a look at the modes of transportation between areas, those were also segregated. My parents have vivid memories of having to change train cars as they're making their way from one part of the country to another. The racial segregation was a big part of their experience, and much of that is reflected to this day. And it wasn't just our parks, it was also our beaches and picnic areas. Areas were designated for racial segregation. And it's important to understand that we need to take a look at these areas of separation, not just in terms of the political strife of the time, but also in terms of our natural resources. Because much of what we're still contending with today when it comes to equal rights is access to housing, access to jobs, access to equal representation under the law. Much of the things that my parents were fighting for were many of the things that we're still debating right now. And if you take a look at what the civil rights movement was driving towards, in this photograph that you'll probably recognize of Martin Luther King Jr. standing in front of over 250,000 people on the Washington Mall, it's at this moment when he gives the I Have a Dream speech. And he's talking about how he will ultimately define equality in our country. And one of the things that he said in the very last paragraph, I think gives a nod to the possibility that his dream actually doesn't indeed include spending time in nature. It reads as follows: if America is to be a great nation, this must be true. So let freedom ring from every mountainside. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Now, I think it's safe to say that he was speaking metaphorically, but I also think that there's the prospect of the possibility that he was actually speaking literally. In the same year that the I Have a Dream speech, a gentleman by the name of Charles Monroe Crenshaw was a member of the Seattle Mountaineers. But prior to that, he was actually a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was a flight engineer for the fighter pilots that were flying bomber air support missions for the bomber pilots that were invading Europe during the Second World War. He came back to the United States, relocated to the Pacific Northwest, and became an avid active outdoorsman. In fact, he was a wilderness guide. He was a field instructor. In 1964, a year after the I Have a Dream speech, he was invited to become a member of the 37th expedition to the highest peak in North America, a mountain commonly known as Denali. Now, the interesting thing is that these stories intersect in the cover in a story in Ebony magazine. The magazine profiles King's March on Washington, but it also tells this story of a weekend climber. And what's especially interesting about Crenshaw is that he is also a flight engineer working on the missions to go to the moon in the late 1960s. So as a person of color in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights era, he was literally helping to put men on the moon. But he also had a sense of adventure for himself. And here, as he's making his way along the Carson's Ridge, taking the northern route from the Muldrow Glacier, he's quite literally ascending to the height of America. And ironically, on July 2nd, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. overlooks the shoulder of Lyndon Johnson as he's signing into law the Civil Rights Act. But 7 days later, Crenshaw summits Denali and quite literally personifies King's mountain dream by becoming the very first Black American to make it to the summit of the highest peak in North America. And what's remarkable is that if you take a look at this summit photograph, I think it's a beautiful illustration of exactly what King was talking about in the I Have a Dream speech, so that one can be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. In this photograph, it's rather difficult to tell who the African American is, but what's important is that here we have people coming together to do something remarkable in the outdoors. Just so you know, the person on the far left is Crenshaw. The person on the far right is Alan Randall, the expedition leader. The person in the middle is Alan's wife, Frances, who became the third woman to summit Denali on that same expedition. And on this trip, they put 15 climbers on the summit, more climbers than had ever been achieved at any point at the time. So it was a historic event, but sadly, history forgets it. But I think that it's important to understand what it was like for Crenshaw at the time. And he said in his report in the story that it had been so easy today for most of the climbers that it had been hard for them to realize that they were actually standing on the summit of Mount McKinley, the highest point of North America. Climbers found themselves searching through the clouds for something yet higher. And I take that quote to heart because it's really not just about climbing mountains. It's really about ascending to other things, things that actually have even deeper, broader resonance. And frankly, I think that can include a much more expansive vision of how we can encourage more people to spend time in the outdoors, so that as we build in population, we can also build our core base of advocacy so that more and more people can see themselves as part of the natural environment and hopefully ultimately work to protect it. And as it happens, I sincerely believe that King's dream can also include spending time in nature. And much of what we are talking about when it comes to environmental justice, equal rights, civil rights, also means equal access to nature. And it's especially important as we are encouraging and training young people to become part of the broad environmental movement. And I think perhaps more than anything else, it's critical that we realize that climbing mountains and spending time in nature isn't necessarily a solitary experience. And I think that we travel furthest by traveling together. And in 2013, working with the National Outdoor Leadership School, also known as NOLS, we put together a project to do something that had never been done before. We went around the country and recruited people who had an interest in climbing, but also were working very directly in their communities to improve the representation of people of color in the outdoors. We managed to find a team of 9 climbers, 6 men, 3 women, ranging in age between 17 and 56, to put together a team of climbers that would ultimately be able to have an experience similar to Charles Crenshaw, so that we can literally take that 1964 vision of climbing the highest peak in North America and bringing it to a modern expression in a project that we called Expedition Denali. And it's in this climbing expedition that framed the basis of my book, The Adventure Gap. And it was also the central focus of our film on the climb called An American Ascent. Because one of the things that we wanted to do is quite literally change the face of the outdoors so that we could literally create new characters. We can bring new people into this environment and tell their story, to change the focus, change the lens, and change the perspective from which we tell these stories so that we can have a higher degree of representation that is inclusive of more types of people. And I think what's most important is being able to be part of this environment as ourselves, not trying to put on the trappings of the dominant culture, but to be expressions of who we are as individuals and also as a people. With these characters that we were able to come out of this narrative, we were actually able to come back to the lower 48 and tell some pretty remarkable stories about not only exploration, but being able to spend time in the outdoors in a meaningful way. So that members of the expedition and those who were affiliated with it could come back to begin careers and jobs in outdoor recreation, including working for the National Park Service. The youngest member of our team, Tyree Moore, became a NOLS instructor in his own right, and he ultimately went on to climb Kilimanjaro. He did climb at Aconcagua and made another attempt on Denali. And the youngest person in our team actually went on to do some pretty remarkable things by actually starting his own nonprofit that is dedicated to making sure that people in his community have access to the outdoors. It's a program that he calls Soul Track. The oldest member of our team, Stephen Shobe, still has aspirations to climb the 7 summits. And through his story, I was actually able to profile his long narrative in an article in Alpinist magazine that describes him as a local hero. And I think perhaps the most exciting thing was being able to have this story shared at the White House. The Obama administration invited myself and several of our team members to come out and tell the story of Expedition Denali. But unfortunately, because of complications in the schedule, the president couldn't be there. If you take a look at this photograph of the White House, it looks a little like it's rainbow color, and that's not by accident. It happened that the night that we were there was the same day that the Supreme Court made its landmark decision on gay marriage. But something else happened that day as well. The president was in South Carolina to eulogize the 9 members of the church in Charleston, where a white supremacist killed 9 parishioners. And while we were telling our story in front of 350 youth from the Baltimore, DC area, Barack Obama was actually in South Carolina singing Amazing Grace and bringing comfort to that community there. But one of the things that was especially disappointing to most of us was the fact that a former US Senator, a gentleman by the name of Clementa Pinckney, was killed in this attack. And he was honored by the then President of the United States. But as his casket is being taken to the memorial service, it was made to go by the state capitol building. And by law at the time, the US and state flag were at half mast, but the Confederate flag was actually held at full mast as his caisson and a horse-drawn carriage was being driven past. And it was so disappointing and so devastating to many of the people in the community. A woman by the name of Bree Newsom took it upon herself the next day to climb the flagpole and remove the Confederate flag. Now, in this act of defiance, she made it very clear that this is something that had to change. And for all of us watching and paying attention to this story, I think many of us were thrilled to see that change was achieved by a climber. And what was remarkable was that within 6 months, the state of South Carolina permanently removed the Confederate flag from the state grounds. And when we take the time to make these kinds of changes, we can introduce and inspire many people, particularly people of color, to embrace the outdoors as not only a pastime, but also as a career. And from that, we have a huge resurgence of new, what I describe as affinity groups, organizations that work directly with communities of color to allow them to experience the outdoors as themselves, whether they identify as men or women, whether they define themselves as Latino, Black, or Native American. Also in terms of gender identity for the LGBTQ community, and also for people who define themselves by different body types. There's a place for everyone in the outdoors. And if we work towards inclusivity, we can make a world where everyone is welcome. And from that, we have the ability to tell a new set of stories by defining the face of adventure so that we can tell, again, more stories. In 2018, I had the privilege of writing this cover story for Outside Magazine that profiled 20 young people in the outdoor industry that are really changing the face of what the outdoors looks like. And this is now the new face of adventure. But what's especially remarkable too is that we've had the chance to make changes at the state and federal level. Particularly during the Obama administration, we were able to make quite a few strides by engaging with the administration to create new policies. And on January 12, 2017, the president signed, with the support of several organizations that I've had the privilege of working with, to create what can be described as the Presidential Memorandum on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in Public Land Management. And the tenets of this was defined to tell a more inclusive and complete story of American places we protect, to include diverse voices in the decision-making process of new public lands and waters, and also to increase the number of outreach programs dedicated to provide better access for diverse communities. Also, what's especially remarkable about the Obama administration was that on this date as well, he signed into existence 5 new national monuments, both recognizing the civil rights movement and also several nature-based sites, including the Bears Ears National Monument. In total, the Obama administration designated 34 national monuments, more than any president in US history. In fact, only Bill Clinton had designated more national monuments and national parks than even Teddy Roosevelt. And I think that it's a good place to start this conversation, because it's critically important to understand that the conservation of our natural resources is indeed the fundamental problem. And unless we solve that problem, it avails us little to solve all of the others. Because I think that the only way that we can do that is to make sure that everyone is engaged and involved in the preservation of our public land. And I definitely think that that is ultimately how we can make our world capable of sustaining human life for generations yet to come. I really want to say thank you for allowing me to speak with you today. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to engage with me online, you'll find all of my social media handles at joytripproject.com. And with the 15 minutes or so that we've got left, I would love to answer questions from the audience. Or Siri, if you've got things that you'd like to ask me, I'd be happy to stop sharing my screen and answer your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, James. I know I learned so much in that presentation. I know we've got a few folks joining us live tonight, so please feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. You're also more than welcome to use the chat if that is better for you. Don't be shy. I know on Zoom there's always that awkward pause where you wait for people to ask questions, so feel free to jump in. I have a couple that I was just thinking about through your presentation, James, and
Please.
one of them is thinking about, you know, approaching feeling welcome and inclusiveness as a white person, say myself. I'm an outdoor enthusiast. I love being in nature. What, you know, recognizing that it is so important to diversify the population of people who are enjoying the outdoors, a huge responsibility lives with those in those spaces who hold social privilege because of the color of the skin, their economic advantages, all those kinds of things. What kind of what can individuals who do hold those identities of privilege do to help make these spaces feel more welcome for people who may not look like them or move like them or have the same economic advantages as them?
Sure. I think the best, most important thing that I can tell you is that we need to understand that we have privilege, you know, and it's not, you know, relegated exclusively to white people. You know, I think that, you know, as a person who didn't grow up in poverty, I know that I have certain privileges simply because of socioeconomic advantages. So I think that we need to begin by recognizing the privileges that we have. And I think that more importantly, we need to make sure that we use that privilege to empower others. You know, and I think part of that is being able to recognize that, you know, for whatever reason, not everybody feels welcome in our national parks. You know, and we shouldn't say, well, I've never felt uncomfortable in national parks, and you shouldn't feel uncomfortable either, which is the common response. I think instead, what we need to do is we quite literally say, it's a shame that you don't feel welcome in the national parks. What can I do to help you feel more comfortable? You know, and in many ways, the individual really can't do much of anything, you know, other than to nod and smile and to treat people with respect and dignity, which is the least we can do as citizens. But what we can do is we can support our national parks in, you know, through our tax dollars, through volunteerism, and through municipal support to create interpretive opportunities so that we tell more stories, you know, that are reflective of the entire park experience. Because like I said, I mean, I was in my 40s before I heard the Buffalo Soldier story for the first time. Now children are hearing that story on their very first visit to the national parks. That's relatively new. You know, and I would really like to see more of that. I mean, how can we go about, you know, making these substantive changes and additions to our culture and our society that are inclusive of everyone? You know, and again, I think the best way to do that is through interpretation, you know, through signage, you know, through programming, you know, reenactments, you know, all the things that help us to learn our collective history. And that's the other thing. I think that it's really important that we recognize that it is all of our history, you know, so we can't just focus exclusively on the predominant narrative, which we have a tendency of doing. You know, we know all about the founding fathers, you know, that we are allowed to recognize, but we need to understand that, you know, at the turn of the creation of our country, there was the population of the country at the time was actually 20% Black. You know, the percentage of the population of people of color in 1776 was even higher than it is today. You know, and so we need to recognize that there's history, heritage, and legacy of a lot of people that we don't typically include in our narratives. And I think that one of the ways that we exercise our privilege is making room to tell all the stories and not just the ones that make us comfortable.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question from the group that I'll read out for you. Wow, what a great and informative presentation. Thank you. As an organization, Wilderness Inquiry works with people of all different backgrounds and abilities. And recently we have been exploring if it makes sense, more sense to offer more affinity groups, like you mentioned, to potentially have people feel more welcome. And we also see value in trips that are open to all. Do you have thoughts on the importance of affinity group versus trips for all and potentially the role of partnerships in that?
Okay, that's a really good question, Julie. Thank you very much for that. And I can tell you that, if you'd asked me that question a decade ago, I would have said something to the effect of, all trips should be for everyone, and there should be no designation of people of color versus not people of color. I think what is most important is that you create a safe and secure and comfortable environment. And at this point in time, sometimes that could be an all affinity person group, because it's at that point you're allowing a certain amount of agency, a certain amount of cultural competency that is reflective of a person's lived experience, so that you're not having the dominant culture tell you what to do. You actually have your community, your peer group, share with you an experience that you can ultimately emulate. And I can tell you just from recent experience over the last decade where I've been in affinity group spaces, and despite my comfort with talking to a variety of different audiences, I can't tell you what a relief it was for me to be in a group of people that I didn't have to explain myself in.
Mhm.
There wasn't a single person who didn't understand where I was coming from, because we all came from the same place. We've all had suffered the same type of microaggressions. We've all had the experience of being followed around a store. We've all had the experience of being underestimated simply because you're doing something that people who look like you don't typically do.
Mhm.
So I think that it's important that those trips are available. Now, having said that, my biggest concern long term is that that's all we ever do. That we will ultimately only go on a camping trip or a hiking trip or a paddling trip with people who look like us. I think there's a problem with that too. I think that we need to, especially when we're working with people who are just being introduced to this, to ease them into it by providing a positive, nurturing environment that it is as with as little challenge as possible from a cultural standpoint. But then ultimately, as their competency improves, as their interests and their abilities and their skill sets improve, to be able to slowly broaden the scope, so that they, not unlike myself and probably many of the people that you currently lead trips with, are very comfortable with whomever they're with, because at that point, the shared culture is the outdoors. The shared environment is our campground and our lakeshore or our river or our hiking trail, because we're coming to it then from the same place. Initially, yes, I think that affinity groups are very important. Long term, I definitely think that the goal should be to make sure that people are comfortable to recreate with whomever that they will encounter. Because if we're successful, and I hope we are, there will be a lot of different people in the outdoors, and we're going to need to learn how to live and work and play with all of them.
Right. Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we have, that's just a comment in the chat. I really appreciate that response. Thank you. I love that. The shared culture is the outdoors. The shared environment is our campground. That's really great. We have another one in the Q&A. This was amazing. Thank you. I try to bring members from my community, largely Latinx, African American, and Somali, to go camping, kayaking, and hiking with me as much as I can. A lot of them are scared to do so or ask if we will have a white person with us. They are not scared of nature. They're scared of leaving the Twin Cities to go to areas they know they may not feel welcome. I assume you have had a similar experience. How do you handle this? I can't guarantee people won't stare, because they often stare at me, and that's not even the worst that can happen.
Right. No, and there's nothing worse than feeling that degree of discomfort. Adrian, thank you so much for your question. And I can tell you, just last summer, I led a group of African-American fathers and their sons on their very first overnight hiking trip. And it was a little disconcerting because, we're going in an area of northern Wisconsin that, I had never been there before. But it was important that we visit a national scenic hiking trail, the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin, and also a national forest. We went to the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. And essentially what I was able, and oddly enough, the pandemic kind of helped because it kind of limited the number of people that we would encounter anyway. And we created what I like to call an escape pod, where we mainly got everyone with positive COVID tests. We'd done a couple of shakedown hikes in advance, and everyone was comfortable with one another. But also we had, common accommodations, so we were able to prepare our meals together. We were actually able to build kind of a safety bubble, of a community of our own. And I got to tell you, for the course of 3 days, we didn't see a single person that wasn't in our group. So the stairs weren't the issue. The treatment wasn't an issue. It was strictly a matter of managing people's experience in the outdoors. Now, having said all that, now that the restrictions have started to lift, that's going to change very soon. And so the question then is, how do you deal with that? Well, believe it or not, that bubble of safety in an affinity group can actually be very empowering and very supportive, especially if you're with a group of people and you're not the only one who's getting stared at, and frankly, if you are, being a good citizen and exercising, good social cultural values, they'll look twice, but they won't ask embarrassing questions, and they will probably treat you with respect. I think most importantly, Adrian, the best advice I can give you is to take up space with pride and confidence, and do your thing. The outdoors is yours, and I'm going to encourage you to lead your trips and take people out there and be the person that will shrug off the stairs. And again, that's not to say that you won't necessarily encounter, people with ill intent out there, but that's going to happen anywhere in the world right now. You can't let that deter you from spending time in the outdoors. These public lands are yours to enjoy, and I think that you should.
Awesome. Thank you, James. We've got a couple more, and I think we've got a couple minutes left, so we'll try to get through them. This says, hi, James. I'm a group scoutmaster with Outdoor Service Guides based in Minneapolis that promotes inclusivity and outdoor for youth and adults. What is your best advice for a new nonprofit like us to do the baby step, bringing BIPOC families into the outdoors? And how do we break the ice with these families?
Good question. Chung-Ying, thank you very much for that. And again, something I've experienced myself. I think the best thing you can do is create allies within those communities first. And essentially, rather than you going in and telling them what you're going to do, you let your ambassadors, your allies, your go-betweens basically tell you what their people want. Like for example, the trip that I led last summer, they let me know that camping was not going to happen. That was going to be a non-starter. But rather than having that be a hurdle, I used it as an opportunity, and we figured out a way to get, beds to accommodate, the entire group, and everyone was completely comfortable. We even had, cable television and flush toilets, but it was a really good hiking experience nonetheless. The long and short of it is you need to meet people where they are, and I think that it's really important that you have a certain degree of parity, so that as you're introducing yourself to people, you're not doing it from a authoritarian standpoint, but instead you're actually doing it in such a way where you are hopefully helping to facilitate your allies' interest in being a leader within their community. And hopefully one day you'll just be able to step back and let them come to you. and to get more training, more expertise. If they enjoyed hiking, they might decide, oh, well, now we want to try snowshoeing. And so you got a certain amount of rapport and skill sets and interest, so that you can make a couple of lateral moves, and then you can start escalating, so that suddenly, you're talking about snowshoeing, then you might even venture into winter camping, or cross-country skiing, or, Boundary Waters canoe paddling. I mean, there's so many different things, especially in Minnesota, that you can do. But as you said, it's baby steps, but don't be afraid to, take really small baby steps, because sometimes your first overnight camping trip might be in a city park. It doesn't have to be a national park. You don't have to go, for a week-long adventure. It could just be, a late night campfire, and that's how you get started. That's how you build rapport.
Excellent, thank you. I know we're a minute over, James, and I want to be respectful of your time. Looks like we have one more question in the Q&A. Is that okay? Okay.
Sure.
This might seem like a basic question, and you mentioned a few earlier on, but if you were to share what you think the barriers are to people of color accessing the outdoors, what are the top few that come to mind? And what do you think it would be like as a collective whole to address these? What would you view as success?
Okay, Julie, great question. Here's the thing. Many of the big barriers are gone. There are no more laws. There aren't literal signs. There are figurative signs that tell people that they don't belong, but there's no legislative signs. So the hard work is done. The barriers that exist now are typically the barriers that exist in people's minds based on their sense of apprehension. And the way to remove those concerns or those barriers is to, first of all, identify them and do what you can to mitigate them. So one of the barriers, quite frankly, is cost. So if you can do something to provide discounted gear, or maybe subsidize the cost of entrance fees to parks, or a trail pass or something like that, that's one way to remove the economic barrier. If one of the barriers is knowledge or experience, I think it would be really worthwhile to host a series of workshops that provide advanced skills training before you even go on the trip. And I know that REI in Minneapolis and in St. Paul does a great job of teaching classes. So if your group would like to, get a certain set of skills, most of REI's classes are free, but if they cost something, you can help to subsidize that cost. Or more importantly, you can go together as a group, and you can have it be a learned experience, and then maybe create an opportunity where you're, learning these skills separately as a group with one another. And then finally, I think, to me, what success looks like is not having to think about this anymore. When the day comes when, it's so funny. This is the second of 3 talks that I'm giving this week on this same topic. I look forward to the day where I'm doing, one a year, because this conversation is quaint, and we'll talk about what it was like in the olden days. The long and short of it is that I think that we can put ourselves in an environment where, we can have, multi-generations of people from communities of color today to have positive experiences in the outdoors, so that, if we want to look at it at a statistical measurement, let's say that in 10 years, the Black population is 14% of the US population. To me, the best sign of success would be people of color representing 14% of US national park visitors. We're a long way from that, definitely more than a decade, but I think that would be a good goal to work towards.
Well, that's amazing, James. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Really, really appreciate it. We've got some thank yous and some great comments in the chat. Folks on this call, feel free to check out more about what James is up to, the joytripproject.com. And of course, check out wildernessinquiry.org for ways to get involved in our programs as well. Thanks again, James. Best of luck with the rest of your summer. I hope you get to enjoy more fun adventures, and we will hope to cross paths again soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much. And everyone, enjoy your evening. Good night.
Bye, everyone.